Hey everyone, welcome to your deep dive. We're diving into Javier Milei today and his bold attempt to reshape Argentina's economy with this libertarian approach.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Argentina has this long history of economic ups and downs,
Right.
which is often linked to Peronism, and this has been the dominant political ideology in the country for decades now.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't experts on Argentina's history, can we unpack Peronism a little bit and how it shaped the economic landscape that Milei inherited when he came into power?
Yeah, so essentially, Peronism comes from Juan Perón's presidency back in the 1940s, and it advocates for a strong role of government in the economy. So think like social welfare programs, nationalized industries, protectionist trade policies. It's a system that prioritizes social justice and workers' rights, but it has been criticized for economic inefficiencies and creating a dependence on government intervention.
Interesting. So then comes along Javier Milei, our unconventional economist, with this completely different vision, libertarianism.
Right.
So instead of leaning on the government, he's all about free markets, limited intervention, and individual liberty as drivers of economic prosperity.
And he's definitely not just talking the talk.
Huh.
Milei is known for his fiery rhetoric and his disdain for what he calls the parasitic state.
Yeah.
He rose to fame by making these complex economic ideas accessible to the average person through things like passionate TV debates and appearances.
Right. He's like a rock star economist in a way.
Totally.
But what's really captured global attention is how quickly he's putting these libertarian ideals into action.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of his first moves as president was to tackle inflation, which has been a problem for Argentina for years now.
Right.
And he implemented what some people call economic shock therapy by slashing government spending, cutting subsidies, and basically forcing the country on this strict financial diet.
And the effects were almost immediate.
Yeah.
Reports show monthly inflation plummeting from double digits to around 4% in a matter of months.
It's an impressive statistic for sure. And by reducing government spending, the idea is that you decrease the money supply, which in turn should help curb inflation. But it's also important to note that this approach has its critics.
So let's dig into that. What are some of the potential downsides or concerns being raised about this rapid deflationary approach? Who's feeling the pinch?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is the impact on social programs. When you cut government spending that drastically, social safety nets, healthcare and education often bear the brunt of it.
Right.
While Milei argues that these cuts are essential for long-term growth, critics worry about the immediate impact on the most vulnerable segments of society.
So it's that classic debate of the potential for long-term gain versus the immediate cost.
Exactly.
But slashing government spending was just one piece of Milei's strategy. He also set his sights on deregulating the housing market, which had been heavily controlled for years.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. He basically took a wrecking ball to regulations, dismantling rent control policies, and loosened restrictions on property development. It was a bold move for sure, intended to stimulate the housing market by attracting investment and boosting supply.
And did it work? What were the real-world effects of this deregulation? Did it create the intended housing boom?
It definitely shook things up. In the months following deregulation, we saw a significant increase in housing construction. With fewer regulations, it became easier and more profitable for developers to build. And with a surge in supply, rents actually started to decrease, dropping by an average of 26%.
Wow, 26%. That's a significant drop. It sounds like Milei's gamble, at least in this instance, paid off. But I imagine not everyone was happy with these changes.
You're right. While renters might have celebrated lower prices, those who relied on rent control for affordable housing faced new challenges. And there were concerns that this influx of new development might not cater to all income levels, potentially exacerbating existing inequalities.
Right. It's a reminder that even with seemingly positive outcomes, there are always winners and losers, and the long-term consequences often take time to fully understand.
Precisely. It's like a game of economic chess, with each move having ripple effects across the entire board. And we're still in the early stages of this particular match.
So we've got inflation somewhat under control, a newly energized housing market, but we all know a strong economy depends on more than just those factors. What about security? How did Milei address Argentina's long-standing struggle with crime, which had been a major deterrent for investment and growth?
This is where Milei, despite his libertarian leanings, took a surprisingly tough stance. He argued that a secure environment was fundamental for economic prosperity and made tackling crime a cornerstone of his policy.
So instead of shrinking the government's role in security like a lot of people expected, he actually expanded it. That seems kind of like a departure from his typical libertarian playbook.
It does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But Milei argued that having a safe and secure environment is really a prerequisite for a thriving free market.
Okay.
He believed that rampant crime was stifling investment and holding the economy back. So he actually increased funding for law enforcement, implemented stricter sentencing guidelines, and took a zero-tolerance approach to crime.
And what impact did this crackdown have? Did it move the needle on crime rates at all?
The results were pretty dramatic, actually.
Okay.
Within the first 9 months of Milei's presidency, the homicide rate in Argentina plummeted by an astounding 70%.
Wow.
Now, it's important to note that attributing such a significant drop to a single policy is always complex.
Right.
There are often multiple factors at play.
Of course, but even if other factors contributed, a 70% drop is hard to ignore. It suggests that Milei's focus on security, even if it meant a more assertive government role, yielded tangible results.
Precisely. And this also highlights an important nuance within libertarian thought.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that while limiting government intervention is generally the goal, there are certain areas like public safety where a strong and effective government is essential for creating the conditions for individual liberty and economic prosperity.
It's a reminder that real-world governance is rarely about rigid ideology. It's
Right.
about pragmatically addressing specific challenges, even if it means occasionally deviating from the textbook.
Exactly. And this brings us to a crucial point about Milei's Argentina. It's an ongoing experiment, a work in progress,
Right.
and it's still too early to draw definitive conclusions about its long-term success or failure.
That's right. We've seen the initial shockwaves, the immediate impacts on inflation, housing, and crime, but what about the ripple effects? What are some of the potential long-term consequences, both positive and negative, that experts are watching closely?
Well, one of the most pressing concerns revolves around inequality.
Okay.
While Milei's rapid reforms have yielded some impressive short-term results, critics worry about their long-term impact on social mobility and income disparity.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? How might these reforms exacerbate existing inequalities or create new ones?
It comes down to who benefits most from these changes.
Okay.
While deregulation and tax cuts can definitely stimulate economic growth, the benefits aren't always distributed evenly.
Right.
Some argue that without robust social safety nets and targeted investments in education and healthcare, the gap between the rich and the poor could widen.
So it's a question of balance. Can Milei's pro-growth policies generate enough overall prosperity to uplift everyone? Or will a rising tide lift only the yachts, leaving a significant portion of the population struggling to keep afloat?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that only time will answer. Another concern is the long-term sustainability of Milei's approach.
What do you mean by sustainability? Are there concerns that these initial gains might be short-lived?
Yeah, some experts argue that Milei's economic shock therapy, while effective in the short term, might not be sustainable in the long run.
Okay.
They point out that Argentina has a history of boom and bust cycles, often fueled by unsustainable economic policies.
So the question is, can Milei break this cycle? Can he establish a truly stable and sustainable economic foundation for Argentina?
Exactly. It requires more than just quick fixes and short-term gains. It demands structural reforms, fiscal discipline, and a commitment to long-term planning that has often been elusive in Argentine politics. Another key factor to consider is the global context.
Right. Argentina doesn't exist in a vacuum. How is the international community reacting to Milei's experiment? Are other nations looking at Argentina as a potential model or as a cautionary tale?
It's a bit of both, actually.
Really?
Milei's radical approach has certainly captured the attention of world leaders, particularly those grappling with their own economic challenges.
I imagine some are intrigued by the prospect of swift action and tangible results, but are there others who are more skeptical?
Absolutely. Some view Milei's policies as a dangerous gamble, a recipe for instability and social unrest. They worry that his rapid-fire reforms lack the nuance and consideration for social safety nets that are crucial for long-term stability.
So the world is watching with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. It seems Argentina has become a real-time case study in the potential benefits and risks of radical economic change.
Precisely. And it highlights a fundamental question that nations around the world are grappling with. What is the role of government in the 21st century?
Right.
Should it be a catalyst for growth through deregulation and free market principles? Or should it prioritize social welfare and a more active role in mitigating inequality?
It's a question with no easy answers, and it's one that each nation, each society must grapple with based on its own unique circumstances, values, and aspirations. It's really remarkable to see how Milei's experiment is prompting global discussion. It's like Argentina has become a giant economic laboratory, and everyone's watching to see what happens next.
And that's what makes it so compelling. Regardless of your political stance, you have to admit that Milei's Argentina is a captivating case study. It forces us to confront fundamental questions about the role of government, the limits of free markets, and the difficulties of economic reform in our interconnected world.
It's definitely given us all a lot to think about. As we start to wrap up our deep dive into Argentina's economic transformation under Javier Milei, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing you want them thinking about after listening?
I think the key takeaway here is that there are no easy answers in economics. Miley's approach is bold, unconventional, and has definitely yielded some impressive short-term results, but it's also a gamble. A high-stakes experiment with consequences both good and bad that we might not fully understand for years or even decades.
So it's a story without an ending, at least not yet. And it reminds us that economics is rarely about simple solutions or predictable outcomes. It's about dealing with complexity, recognizing nuance, and understanding that there are often multiple paths toward achieving a more prosperous and equitable future, each with its own advantages and risks.
Perfectly said. And as Argentina continues on this new path, it reminds all of us to participate in thoughtful, informed, and respectful conversations about the kind of world, the kind of economies we want to build for ourselves and for future generations.
Absolutely. Because these aren't just abstract economic theories we're talking about. This is about real people, their lives, their hopes for a brighter future. And it's our responsibility to stay informed, engage in these conversations, and work together to build a world where everyone has access to prosperity and opportunity. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating one.